Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 72. With our book today, meditation on the intersection between obsession, madness, irony, and the detached nature of nature itself. What I personally consider to be the great American novel of the 19th century, Herman Melville's Moby-Dick, or The Whale. There she blows, a hump like a snow hill. It's Moby-Dick. And we open from chapter 1 of Moby-Dick. I have the Wordsworth Classics edition. I'll be reading from that today. And so I want to begin with chapter 1, Loomings. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking off people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to the sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There's nothing surprising in this, if they but knew it. Almost all men, in their degree, sometime or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings toward the ocean with me. There is now your insular city of the Manhattoes, belted round by wharves as Indian isles by coral reefs. Commerce surrounds it with her surf. Right and left, the streets take you waterward. Its extreme downtown is the Battery, where that noble mole is washed by waves and cooled by breezes which, a few hours previous, were out of sight of land. Look at the crowds of water-gazers there. Circumambulate the city of a dreamy Sabbath afternoon. Go from Corlear's Hook to Coynes' Slip, and from thence by Whitehall northward. What do you see? Posted like silent sentinels all around the town stand thousands upon thousands of mortal men fixed in ocean reveries. Some leaning against the spiles, some seated upon pierheads, some looking over the bulwarks of ships from China, some high aloft in the rigging as if striving to get a still better seaward peep. But these are all landsmen, of weekdays pent up in lath and plaster, tied to counters, nailed to benches, clinched to desks. How then is this? Are the green fields gone? What do they hear? But look! Here come more crowds, pacing straight for the water and seemingly bound for a dive. Strange. Nothing will content them but the extremest limit of the land. Loitering under the shady lee of yonder warehouses will not suffice. No, they must get just as nigh the water as they possibly can without falling in. And there they stand, miles of them, leagues, inlanders all. They come from lanes and alleys, streets and avenues, north, east, south, and west. Yet here they all unite. Tell me, does the magnetic virtue of the needles of the compasses of all those ships attract them thither? Once more, say you are in the country, in some high land of lakes. Take almost any path you please, and 10 to 1 it carries you down a dale, and leaves you there by a pool in the stream. There is magic in it. Let the most absent-minded of men be plunged in his deepest reveries. Stand that man on his legs, set his feet a-going, and he will infallibly lead you to water, if water there be in all that region. Should you ever be athirst in the great American desert, try this experiment. If your caravan happen to be supplied with a metaphysical professor, yes, as everyone knows, meditation and water are wedded forever. But here, as an artist, he desires to paint you the dreamiest, shadiest, quietest, most enhancing bit of romantic landscape in all the valley of the Saco. What is the chief element he employs? There stand his trees, each with a hollow hunk, as if a hermit and a crucifix were within, and here sleeps his meadow, and there sleep his cattle, and up from yonder cottage goes a sleepy smoke. Deep into distant woodland winds a mazy way reaching to overlapping spurs of mountains bathed in their hillside blue. But though the picture lies thus tranced, and though his And though this pine tree shakes down its sighs like leaves upon the shepherd's head, yet all were vain, unless the shepherd's eye were fixed upon the magic stream before him. Go visit the prairies in June, when for scores on scores of miles you wade knee-deep among tiger lilies. What is the one charm of wanting? Water? There is not one drop of water there. Were Niagara but a cataract of sand, would you travel your 1,000 miles to see it? Why did the poor poet of Tennessee, upon suddenly receiving 2 handfuls of silver, deliberate whether to buy him a coat, which he sadly needed, or invest his money in a pedestrian trip to Rockaway Beach? Why is almost every robust, healthy boy with a robust, healthy soul in him at some time or other crazy to go to sea? Why, upon your first voyage as a passenger, did you yourself feel such a mystical vibration when first told that you and your ship were now out of sight of land? Why did the old Persians hold the sea holy? Why did the Greeks give it a separate deity and own brother of Jove? Surely all this is not without meaning. And still deeper the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. It states in Psalm 107, in the King James Version of the Bible, the following: They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. Herman Melville, born August 1st, 1819, died September 28th, 1891, was born in New York City, and he himself set out to sea as a common sailor at the age of 19 to ensure his family's perilous economic position. Not well educated, Melville left school at around the age of 12 due to the death of his father, a notorious spendthrift, Alvin Melville. Herman Melville was a self-taught autodidactic. Now, what that means is fundamentally he read everything he could get his hands on, and he absorbed all the information he could from observation and from life experiences, and this all fed his writing. With his lack of formal education, he unfortunately came late to the plays of William Shakespeare and to the writing of John Milton, both of whom would act as heavy influences on Moby-Dick, the book we're reading today. Herman Melville wrote his first novel, Typee, based on his sea adventures in the South Pacific in 1845. He followed this up with a sequel, Omoo, in 1847, and then he launched into writing, like I said, what I consider to be the great novel of the 19th century, Moby-Dick. Now, there's something you have to understand about seagoing and seafaring in the early to middle part of the 19th century. What most people wanted to hear, and we'll explore a little bit about this on the podcast, was about the adventures that whalers and shipbuilders and others were having on the ocean, and of course sailors at that time. You have to understand, these were the celebrities of the day. They were the cultural, if you will, influencers because of the importance of whaling, and we'll talk about why whaling was important, but also the entire industries that had been built around whaling and seafaring in general. Piracy was a huge thing. Matter of fact, the British Empire was very assiduously attempting to wipe out pirates during Melville's time, but piracy on the high seas was still a big deal. And the United States Navy wasn't quite yet what it would become quite a bit later on in the history of the world. So when Moby-Dick was published in 1851, because it was about a whale, but not necessarily about the adventures of going whaling, it was not well received. And ultimately, upon its publication, it was panned widely in 1851. And this led Melville, unfortunately, to having to retain a job in 1866, being unable to work as a professional author as he wanted to after the American Civil War, when the country took another turn and began to focus itself less on the ocean that was to the immediate east of New York City, the Atlantic, and to focus more on the ocean waves of grain that were out west. Melville served as a customs inspector for New York City, and he held that post for 19 years. And he had a reputation for honesty in a notoriously corrupt institution. By the way, Chester A. Arthur, the future president of the United States, was one of the people who really admired Melville's writing and tried to make as much space for Melville while he was working as a customs inspector to do his writing. And, of course, he helped him navigate on the back end, without Melville's knowledge, the corrupt nature of the U.S. Customs Inspector's office in New York City at that time. Herman Melville had a literary life based on not writing, but a literary life based on disappointment and tragedy, not a literary life based on triumph. He's almost the polar opposite of Charles Dickens, and we read A Christmas Carol last year. You should go back and listen to that, and we'll be reading more of Dickens coming up this year on the podcast. But Melville was almost the exact opposite. Never really embraced in his time by his audience, he has been reconsidered beginning in the middle part of the 20th century, and now Moby-Dick is seen as one of the penultimate books of the 19th century. And we're going to talk about all of this, beginning with, the Dickensian aspects of chasing a white whale today on the podcast. Back to the book, back to Moby-Dick. Now we're going to pick this up in chapter 24, titled The Advocate. We're going to find out a little bit about this business of whaling. And I quote, by the way, this is written, almost all of Moby-Dick is written from the perspective of Ishmael. And we'll talk about Ishmael a little bit here coming up later on the podcast. And I quote, "As Queequeg and I are now fairly embarked on this business of whaling, and as this business of whaling has somehow come to be regarded among landsmen as a rather unpoetical and disreputable pursuit, therefore I am all anxiety to convince ye, landsmen, of the injustice hereby done to us hunters of whales. In the first place, it may be deemed almost superfluous to establish the fact that among people at large, the business of whaling is not accounted on a level with what are called the liberal professions. If a stranger were introduced into any miscellaneous metropolitan society, it would but slightly advance the general opinion of his merits, were he presented to the company as a harpooner, say, and if in emulation of the naval officers he should append the initials SWF, sperm whale fishery, to his visiting card, such a procedure would be deemed preeminently presuming and ridiculous. Doubtless, one leading reason why the world declines honoring us whalemen is this: they think that, at best, our vocation amounts to a butchering sort of business, and that when actively engaged therein, we are surrounded by all manner of defilements. Butchers we are, that is true, but butchers also, and butchers of the bloodiest badge, have been all martial commanders, whom the world invariably delights to honor. And as for the matter of the alleged uncleanliness of our business, ye shall soon be initiated into certain facts hitherto pretty generally unknown, and which upon the whole will triumphantly plant the sperm whale ship at least among the cleanliest things of this tidy earth. But even granting the charge in question to be true, what disordered slippery decks of a whale ship are comparable to the unspeakable carrion of those battlefields from which so many soldiers return to drink in all the ladies' plaudits? And if the idea of peril so much enhances the popular conceit of the soldier's profession, let me assure ye that many a veteran who has freely marched up to a battery would quickly recoil at the apparition of the sperm whale's vast tail, fanning into eddies the air over his head. For what are the comprehensible terrors of man compared with the interlinked terrors and wonders of God? But though the world scouts at us whale hunters, yet does it unwittingly pay us the profoundest homage. Yea, all abounding adoration, for almost all the tapers, lamps, and candles that burn round the globe burn, as before so many shrines, to our glory. But look at this matter in other lights. Weigh it in all sorts of scales. See what we whalemen are and have been. Why did the Dutch in De Witt's time have admirals of their whaling fleets? Why did Louis XVI of France, at his own personal expense, fit out whaling ships from Dunkirk and politely invite to that town some score or two of families from our own island of Nantucket? Why did Britain, between the years 1750 and 1788, pay to her whalemen and bounties upwards of £1,000,000? And lastly, how comes it that we whalemen of America now outnumber all the rest of the banded whalemen of the world, sail a navy upwards of 700 vessels, manned by 18,000 men, yearly consuming $4 million the ships, worth at the time of sailing $20 million, and every year importing into our harbors a well-reaped harvest of $7 million? How comes all this, if there be not something puissant in whaling? But this is not the half. Look again. I freely assert that the cosmopolite philosopher cannot, for his life, point out one single peaceful influence which within the last 60 years has operated more potently upon the whole broad world, taken in one aggregate, than the high and mighty business of whaling. One way or another, it has begotten events so remarkable in themselves and so continuously momentous in their sequential issues that whaling may be well regarded as that Egyptian mother who bore offspring themselves pregnant from her womb. It would be a hopeless, endless task to catalog all these things. Let a handful suffice. For many years past, the whale ship has been the pioneer in ferreting out the remotest and least known parts of the earth. She has explored seas and archipelagos, which had no chart, where no Cook or Vancouver had ever sailed. If American and European men of war now peacefully ride in once savage harbors, let them fire salutes to the honor and to the glory of the whale ship, which originally showed them the way, and first interpreted between them and the savages. They may yet celebrate as they will the heroes of exploring expeditions, your Cooks or your Crucicerns, but I say that scores of anonymous captains have sailed out of Nantucket that were as great and greater than your Cook and your Crucicern. For in their succourless empty-handedness they, in the heathenish sharked waters and by the beaches of unrecorded Javelin Islands, battled with virgin wonders and terrors that Cook, with all his marines and muskets, would not have willingly dared. All that is made such a flourish of in the old South Sea voyages, those things that were but the lifetime commonplaces of our heroic Nantucketers, often adventures which Vancouver dedicates 3 chapters to, these men accounted unworthy of being set down in the ship's common log. Ah, the world, oh, the world! Until the whale fishery round Cape Horn, no commerce but colonial, scarcely any intercourse but colonial, was carried on between Europe and the long line of the opulent Spanish provinces on the Pacific coast. It was the whalemen who first broke through the jealous policy of the Spanish crown, touching those colonies, and, if space permitted, it might be distinctly shown how from those whalemen at last eventuated the liberation of Peru, Chile, and Bolivia from the yoke of old Spain, and the establishment of the eternal democracy in those parts. That great America on the other side of the sphere, Australia, was given to the enlightened world by the whalemen. After its first blunder-born discovery by a Dutchman, all other ships long shunned those shores as pestiferously barbarous. But the whale ship touched there. The whale ship is the true mother of that now mighty colony. Moreover, in the infancy of the first Australian settlement, the emigrants were several times saved from starvation by the benevolent biscuit of the whale ship, luckily dropping an anchor in their waters. The uncounted isles of all Polynesia confess the same truth and do commercial homage to the whale ship that cleared the way for the missionary and the merchant, and in many cases carried the primitive missionaries to their first destinations. If that double-bolted land, Japan, is ever to become hospitable, it is the whale ship alone to whom the credit will be due, for already she is on the threshold. Turns out that there have always been dirty jobs, pace micro, jobs that no one is willing to do and that come with all sorts of social appropriation, if I am to use that word. And whaling, well, whaling was one of those jobs back in the 19th century. Kind of like oil drillers and pipeliners today, and of course people involved in fracking. Whaling was a industry that was driven by the need to light houses, quite frankly. And whaling was a serious business in America and Europe for the first half of the 19th century until oil was eventually discovered. Now, the pursuit of whales and whale oil to light houses and to light the streets, particularly of London, but most particularly the houses of the nouveau riche of the time, what we would now call the 1%, created social inequities. The people who could afford whale oil had light, and the people who didn't, well, they had candles or they bumped around in the dark. And I already mentioned Charles Dickens. He was the one that sort of wrote a lot, not necessarily about whaling and whale oil, but he wrote about social inequities that wealth created, the Dickensian aspect of industrialization. And whale oil was the weird middle ground, or represented the weird middle ground, as did the industry of whaling between the end of the 18th century, when the Industrial Revolution was just getting going in England, and in Europe overall, and slightly in America, and of course the long arc of the 19th century that would end in the fields of the Somme. Dickens and many other writers pointed out the social inequities that whaling brought because of the product, whale oil, that it brought to the shores and the wealth that it created for folks. And even Melville puts in the mouth of Ishmael a defense, an apologia, if you will, of the money spent on whaling. This, to our modern ears, sounds weird because, quite frankly, with the fossil fuels that we have, we've moved on to other forms of energy. And now, in the early part of the 21st century, whale watching now puts more whales in danger than whale hunting. Herman Melville would call this ironic. We have not gotten away from the tendency to be guilty about where our fuel comes from. I mean, heck, look at all of the self-flagellating that's going on in the world today about climate change and carbon credits, which stand, of course, in as indulgences for the Dickensian consequences of even daring to operate a capitalistic system of commerce and wealth gathering. But the fact of the matter is, energy has to come from somewhere, and fuel is representative of that energy. And whaling, even as brutal a butchery as it was, which, again, Ishmael, speaking in the voice of in the voice of Herman Melville in Moby-Dick, Ishmael does point out that yes, there is butchery, but there's also butchery in war. There's butchery in cattle. There's butchery in any type of fashion where you are going to go out and get something. You're going to wrest it from nature in order to have it serve man's needs. The lesson for leaders here is very important. We have to be clear-eyed about the morality of what we're doing. We have to know our why. Now, does that mean that our why has to be driven by greed or by lust for power or by endless overconsumption? No, we are required biblically as well as morally and ethically to preserve the world. But we're also required to understand who's at the top of the hierarchy. And quite frankly, human beings are going to be at the top of the hierarchy for a long time to come. We will make the world serve us, but we are also figuring out ways to make the world serve us that are better for the world. This is why in every country that gets wealthier and wealthier, where per capita income increases, so does environmental conscientiousness. Look, leaders, if you want to preserve the environment for the future, make more people wealthier. Back to the book, back to Moby-Dick. As I said before, we're reading today from the Wordsworth Classics edition of Moby-Dick, published in 1993 by Wordsworth Editions Limited in Herefordshire. I believe that is in England. If you want to get an open source copy of Moby-Dick, you can do that on Project Gutenberg, so you might want to go ahead and check that out. And the introduction here was written by, and there are several things I've highlighted in the introduction that have influenced my thinking and my analysis around Moby-Dick. But the introduction, How the Whale Got Its Lungs, was written by, let's see here, David Hurd of the University of Kent at Canterbury. And he points out many interesting things, not only about Herman Melville's life, but also about Herman Melville's approach to writing Moby-Dick, which was unique. He also makes some interesting points about the fellow that, other than Ishmael and the whale, is probably the most important character in Moby-Dick, and that would be the notorious Captain Ahab. And so we're going to pick up with Captain Ahab in chapter 36, the quarter deck, and it's going to be Captain Ahab's speech. And I quote, "Captain Ahab," said Starbuck, who, with Stubb and Flask, had thus far been eyeing his superior with increasing surprise, but at last seemed struck with a thought which somewhat explained all the wonder. "Captain Ahab, I have heard of Moby-Dick, but it was not Moby-Dick that took off thy leg?" "Who told thee that?" cried Ahab. Then pausing, Starbuck, my hearties all round. It was Moby-Dick that dismasted me. Moby-Dick that brought me to this dead stump I stand on now. He shouted with a terrific loud animal sob, like that of a heart-stricken moose. It was that accursed white whale that razzed me, made me a poor begging lubber for me, for ever and a day. Then tossing both arms with measureless imprecations, he shouted out, Aye, and I'll chase him round Good Hope, and round the Horn, and round the Norway Maelstrom, and round perdition's flames before I give him up. And this is what ye have shipped for, men, to chase that white whale on both sides of land and over all sides of earth till he spouts black blood and rolls fin out. What say ye, men? Will ye splice hands on it now? I think ye do look brave. Aye, shouted the harpooners and seamen, running closer to the excited old man. A sharp eye for the white whale, a sharp lance for Moby-Dick. God bless ye, he seemed to half sob and half shout. God bless ye, men. Steward, go draw the great measure of grog. But what's this long face about, Miss Starbuck? Wilt thou now chase the white whale? Art now thou game for Moby-Dick? I am game for his crooked jaw, and for the jaws of death too, Captain Ahab, if it fairly comes in the way of the business we follow. But I came here to hunt whales, not my commander's vengeance. How many barrels will thy vengeance yield thee, even if thou gettest it, Captain Ahab? It will not fetch thee much in our Nantucket market. Nantucket market? Whoot! But come close, Starbuck, thou requirest a little lower layer. If money's to be the measure of a man, and the accountants have computed their great counting houses, the globe, by girdling it with guineas, 1 to every 3 parts of an inch, then let me tell thee that my vengeance will fetch a great premium here. He smites his chest, whispered Stubb. What's that for? Methinks it rings most vast, but hollow. Vengeance on a dumb brute, cried Starbuck, that simply smote thee from blindest instinct? Madness! To be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab, seems blasphemous. Hark ye yet again, the little lower layer. All visible objects, man, are but pasteboard masks. But at each event in the living act, the undoubted deed, there some unknown but still reasoning thing puts forth the moldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike through the mask, how can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall, shoved near to me. Sometimes I think there's naught beyond, but 'tis enough. He tasks me. He keeps me. I see in him outrageous strength with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. And be the white whale agent or be the white whale principal, I will wreak that hate upon him. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. For could the sun do that, then could I do the other, since there is ever a sort of fair play herein, jealousy presiding over all creations, but not my master man is even that fair play. Who's over me? Truth hath no confines. Take off thine eye, more intolerable than fiends' glarings is a doltish stare. So thou redness and palest, my heart has melted thee to anger glow, but look ye, Starbuck. What is said in heat, that thing unsays itself. These are men from whom warm words are small in dignity. I meant not to incense thee. Let it go. Look, see yonder Turkish cheeks of spotted tawn, living, breathing pictures painted by the sun? The pagan leopards, the unrecking and unworshipping things that live and seek and give no reason for the torrid life they feel. The crew, man, the crew! Are they not the one and all with Ahab in this matter of the whale? See Stubb, he laughs. See yonder Chilean, he snorts to think of it. Stand up amid the general hurricane. Thy one tossed sapling cannot Starbuck. And what is it? Reckon it. 'Tis but to help strike a fin. No wondrous feat for Starbuck. What is it more? From this one poor hunt, then, the best lance out of all Nantucket, surely he will not hang back, when every foremast hand is clutched a whetstone. Ah, constraining sees thee, I see. The billow lifts thee. Speak, but speak. Aye, thy silence, then, that voices thee. Something shot from my dilated nostrils. He has inhaled it in his lungs. Starbuck now is mine. Cannot oppose me now without rebellion. God keep me. Keep us all, murmured Starbuck lowly. But in his joy at the enchanted tacit acquiescence of the mate, Ahab did not hear his foreboding invocation, nor yet the low laugh from the hold, nor yet the presaging vibrations of the winds in the cordage, nor yet the hollow flap of the sails against the masts, as for a moment their hearts sank in. For again Starbuck's downcast eyes lighted up with the stubbornness of life. The subterranean laugh died away. The winds blew on. The sails filled out. The ship heaved and rolled as before. Ah, ye admonitions and warnings, why stay ye not when ye come? But rather are ye predictions, that warnings, ye shadows, yet not so much predictions from without, as verifications of the foregoing things within. For with little external to constrain us, the innermost necessities in our being, these, still drive us on. The measure, cried Ahab. Receiving the brimming pewter and turning to the harpooners, he ordered them to produce their weapons. Then ranging them before him near the capstan with their harpoons in their hands, while his three mates stood at his side with their lances, and the rest of the ship's company formed a circle round the group, he stood for an instant searchingly, eyeing every man of the crew. But those wild eyes met his, as the bloodshot eyes of the prairie wolves meet the eye of their leader, ere he rushes on at their head in the trail of the bison, but alas, only to fall into the hidden snare of the Indian. Drink and pass, he cried, handing the heavy charged flagon to the nearest seaman. The crew alone now drink. Round with it, round! Short draughts, long swallows, men, 'tis hot as Satan's hoof. So it goes, round excellently, it spirals in ye, forks out at the serpent's snapping eye. Well done, almost strained. That way it went, this way it comes. Hand it to me, here's a hollow. Men, ye seem the years, so brimming life is gulped and gone. Steward, refill. There's just something about Captain Ahab. So, chapter 36 is the chapter in Moby-Dick, where he finally gets everybody together, and he gets them to commit by drinking a flagon of grog to going on the path that they would eventually, potentially, all have their lives in peril on. Captain Ahab is almost never looked at from a leadership perspective, but there are several things about Captain Ahab that do strike me as leadership lessons that we can take from his behavior. Some positive. yes, don't get me wrong, there's a bounty of negatives, as a matter of fact. When he says, as he does in that clip that I just read to you, when he says that he's going to chase, speaking of the whale, I'll chase him round Good Hope and round the Horn and round the Norway Maelstrom and round perdition's flames before I give him up. When he says that to Starbuck's pushback, this is a sign of a man obsessed. The reason why Moby-Dick sticks with me as being a great novel is because the distance of the sea, just like the depths of space, is a large, and from our perspective on land, as Ishmael lays it out in the very first chapter of Moby-Dick, it is a seemingly boring place. But there's something to consider. Out there, in that geography, and that's what we're talking about this month on the podcast, the power of place. Well, what's the power of the sea? Well, the power of the geography of the sea, just like the power of the geography of space, right, is that if you're moderately quirky or obsessive or narcissistic or even just greatly psychotically driven or personally ambitious, you can get away from it all. Without any seeming consequences. And that was the draw of the sea for Captain Ahab, and that's the draw of the sea for Ishmael, and it's the draw of the sea for many people who would be leaders. The draw of the unknown is the draw of being able to act without consequence, or at the very minimum, to be able to act with minimal consequence. Leadership in these cases and in these places is driven by charisma, as you can see from Ahab turning on Starbuck and then turning the entire crew against him, and then leaving Starbuck a muttering little nub, right, begging for the forgiveness and for the protection of an almighty transcendent God. Well, that's what happens when you have leadership driven by charisma or driven by personal ambition. Ahab didn't care about money. And at the far end of the continuum of motivations, you will have the more positive things like attention to duty and care for your followers out there in those distant and remote places. By the way, I'm going to bring up Star Trek a little bit later on, but as I'm thinking about it right now, as I'm speaking and talking about this and conceptualizing Moby-Dick, there's a reason why both James T. Kirk and Jean-Luc Picard were very familiar with this book. It's because madness can grip even the most moral and ethical of men out in the vast geography of space, just as it grabbed a formerly sane Ahab. Now, Ahab as a character does have his own backstory and his own history, and we're given some of that in the story from Ishmael's observations and from rumors that he hears about Captain Ahab. And it appears that Ahab was the rare man who was unfazed by tragic circumstances that would bring low a person of a different temperament. He obviously had his leg, go away in a whaling accident. The whale took it. The white whale took it. But he also married a woman he didn't really care about. He also had to deal with all of these accountants and money men who were getting in the way of his ambition. And these sorts of roadblocks, right? Or bumps in the way, or even Ahab would probably say cul-de-sacs stopping him from getting his revenge. These create a character for Ahab, and it's a character that reflects a type of leadership where the leader spins tragedy and trauma into gold in the vast depths of the sea. Ahab couldn't have worked in your average tech company or your average financial institution or your average small business. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got Ishmael, and Ishmael, as the novel's narrator, is the supreme ironist of Moby-Dick. Not the supreme irony, that's what happens to Ahab, but the supreme ironist of the book, the observer, is Ishmael. He's highly temperamentally open, democratic in his friendships. He was friends with the quote-unquote savage Queequeg, and observant in his recordings, without judgment or condemnation. That makes him the opposite of Ahab. Ahab can never tell his own story. He's too busy living it. But Ishmael could never be as obsessed and as caught by the sea as Ahab. He was too busy recording it. Leaders, it turns out you need both recorders and obsessives on your team, and you need to know how to manage both of them successfully in order to escape the geography of the sea. Back to the book, back to Moby-Dick. A meditation at the mouth of madness. So we're going to pick up chapter 41, called Moby-Dick. Already several fatalities had attended his chase. They're talking about chasing the white whale. But those similar disasters, however little bruited ashore, were by no means unusual in the fishery. Yet in most instances, each seemed the white whale's infernal forethought of ferocity, that every dismembering or death that he caused was not wholly regarded as having been inflicted by an unintelligent agent. Judge, then, to what pitches of inflamed, distracted fury the minds of his more desperate hunters were impelled, when amid the chips of chewed boats and the sinking limbs of torn comrades they swam out of the white curd of the whale's direful wrath into the serene, exasperating sunlight that smiled on, as if at a birth or a bridal. His 3 boats stove about around him, and oars and men both whirling in the eddies. One captain, seizing the line knife from his broken prow, had dashed at the whale as an Arkansas duelist at his foe, blindly seeking with a 6-inch blade to reach the phantom deep life of the whale. That captain was Ahab. And then it was that, suddenly sweeping his sickle-shaped lower jaw beneath him, Moby-Dick had reaped away Ahab's leg as a mower of a blade of grass in the field. No turbaned Turk, no hired Venetian or Malay could have smote him with more seeming malice. Small reason was there to doubt, then, that ever since that almost fatal encounter, Ahab had cherished a wild vindictiveness against the whale, all the more fell for that in his frantic morbidness he at last came to identify with him not only all his bodily woes, but all his intellectual and spiritual exasperations. The white whale swum before him as the monomaniac incarnation of all those malicious agencies which some deep men feel eating in them, till they are all left living on with half a heart and half a lung. That intangible malignity which has been from the beginning, to whose dominion even the modern Christians ascribe 1/2 of the worlds, which the ancient Ophites of the East reverenced in their statue devil, Ahab did not fall down and worship it like them, but deliriously transferring its idea to the abhorred white whale, he pitted himself, all mutilated, against it. All that most maddens and torments, all that stirs up the lees of things, all truth with malice in it, all that cracks the sinews and cakes the brain, all the subtle demonisms of life and thought, all evil to crazy Ahab were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby-Dick. He piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all general rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down, and then, as if his chest had been mortar, he burst his hot shell upon it. It is not probable that this monomania in him took its instant rise at the precise time of his bodily dismemberment. Then, in darting at the monster, knife in hand, he had but given loose to a sudden, passionate corporal animosity, and when he received the stroke that tore him, he probably but felt the agonizing bodily laceration, but nothing more. Yet when by this collision forced him to turn towards home, and for long months of days and weeks Ahab in anguish lay stretched together in one hammock, rounding in midwinter that dreary howling Patagonian cape, then it was that his torn body, gashed soul bled into one another, and so interfusing, made him mad. that it was only then, on the homeward voyage, after the encounter, that the final monomania seized him seems all but certain from the fact that at intervals during the passage he was a raving lunatic, and though unlimbed of a leg, yet such a vital strength yet lurked in his Egyptian chest, and was moreover intensified by his delirium, that his mates were forced to lace him up fast, even there, as he sailed raving in his hammock. In his straitjacket he swung to the mad rockings of the gales, and when running into more insufferable latitudes, the ship, with milestone sails spread, floated across the tranquil tropics, and to all appearances the old man's delirium seemed left behind him with the Cape Horn swells, and he came forth from his dark den into the blessed light and air, even then, when he bore that firm, collected front, however pale, and issued his calm orders once again, and his mates thanked God the direful madness was now gone, even then Ahab, in his hidden self, raved on. Human madness is oftentimes a cunning and most feline thing. When you think it fled, it may have become but transfigured into some subtler form. Ahab's full lunacy subsided not, but deepeningly contracted, like the unabated Hudson, when that noble Northman flows narrowly but unfathomably through the Highland Gorge. But, as in his narrow-flowing monomania, not one jot of Ahab's broad madness had been left behind. So in that broad madness, not one jot of his great natural intellect had perished. That before living agent now became the living instrument. If such a furious trope may stand, his special lunacy stormed his general sanity and carried it, and turned all its concentrated cannon upon its own mad mark, so that, far from having lost his strength, Ahab, to that one end, did now possess 1,000-fold more potency than ever he had sanely brought to bear upon any one reasonable object. This is much, yet Ahab's larger, darker, deeper part remains unhinted, but vain to popularize profundities, and all truth is profound, winding far down from within the very heart of this spiked Hotel de Cluny, where we stand, however grand and wonderful. Now quit it, and take your way, ye nobler, sadder souls, to those vast Roman halls of Thermes, where far beneath the fantastic towers of man's upper earth, his root of grandeur, his whole awful essence sits in bearded state, and antique buried beneath antiquities, enthroned on torsos. So with a broken throne, the great gods mocked that captive king. So like a caryatid, he patient sits, upholding on his frozen brow the piled entablatures of ages. Wind ye down there, ye prouder, sadder souls, question that proud, sad king. A family likeness, he did beget ye, ye young exiled royalties, and from your grim sire only will the old state secret come. Now in his heart Ahab had some glimpse of this, namely, all my means are sane, my motive and my object mad, yet without power to kill or change or shun the fact. He likewise knew that to mankind he did long dissemble, in some sort did still. But that thing of his dissembling was only subject to his perceptibility, not to his will determinate. Nevertheless, so well did he succeed in that dissembling, that when the ivory leg he stepped ashore at last, no Nantucketer thought him otherwise, but naturally grieved, and that to the quick, with the terrible casualty which had overtaken him. So clearly, Moby-Dick has influenced quite a lot of books and movies and films and other works, right? It's one of those novels that sits at the bottom of other novels. Clearly, Herman Melville loved the language of Shakespeare, and he loved the language of Milton, and the ideas of spiritual madness that has a psychological root is explored in that clip that I just read. Probably the most famous reference to Moby-Dick comes from Star Trek II, my personal favorite Star Trek movie, The Wrath of Khan, where Khan's pursuit of Captain Kirk is central to the film's theme of vengeance. And The Wrath of Khan deliberately borrows heavily from Moby-Dick. And now, to make those parallels clear to viewers, the writers added a visible copy of Moby-Dick to Khan's dwelling. And Khan liberally paraphrases Ahab, particularly when he quotes Ahab's speech at the end of Moby-Dick, where Ahab says, I'll chase him round the moons of Nibia, or not Ahab, but Khan says, I'll chase him round the moons of Nibia, round the Antares maelstrom, and round perdition's flames before I give him up. That's Khan talking about Kirk. Khan quotes Ahab's tirade at the end of the novel, almost verbatim. That's the piece that I was referencing earlier, where with his final lines, Khan says, to the last I grapple with thee. From hell's heart I stab at thee. For hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee. Who knew you were going to have Shakespearean language in a space epic? But that's the thing with Moby-Dick, right? It's not just about the language. It's not just about the vengeance. It's not just about the white whale. It's also about obsession. And we saw this in Wrath of Khan, but we also see this in a lot of other works that have been influenced by Moby-Dick. We even see it and hear it when we talk about it in our language, right? Now, we may not reference Moby-Dick, but everyone knows what it means in a situation when you say he's off pursuing his white whale, the thing he can't get. Look, you cannot understand Captain Ahab, and you cannot understand leadership very often without understanding obsession. There's one other thing to note, and it ties into this thing about obsession. This is a book that resonates in general with men more than women. And it does that for a whole variety of reasons, but the biggest one is disagreeableness. Men are given freedom in not only in our culture, but also in the fabric of reality itself to be disagreeable, to be the people who are going to single-mindedly pursue a project or single-mindedly pursue a path that might be dangerous. It might be damaging. It might be something that will kill them, but they're going to get it. They're going to pursue it. They're going to chase their white whale. Usually the white whale is not anything that is family-oriented, but it is something that is oriented towards society, towards the larger framework of culture. From bridge building to making constitutions, men can be disagreeable, and that disagreeableness is funneled into obsession, and then obsession builds things in society and culture that in general help people move further down the road and help build civilization. You can agree or disagree with that thesis. That's fine. But I think you can't deny the evidence of it played out in front of your very eyes, even as you drive down the street. To paraphrase from George Gilder, yes, civilization may be built by men with families, but it's built by obsessive men with families, and men who are sometimes disagreeable. Look, Captain Ahab was uncompromising, even in the face of logic, love, relationships. He was married, and even commerce. He didn't care about money. And you can't really do anything with a man like that, as was once quoted in a film talking about, where one character was talking about how to bribe another character. You can't bribe a man out of genuine obsession. You can't bully him, and you can't buy him off. Eventually, at a certain point, you're going to have to kill him, or the thing that he is pursuing is going to kill him. The reason why the whale kills Ahab is because Ahab can't succeed in the end. The greatness and woe of both Satan and Ahab lies in pride. The proud person, Pomer explains, and this is from the introduction to Moby-Dick by David Hurd. He says this: the proud person, Pomer explains, believing that he deserves treatment appropriate to his self-inflated dignity, is quick to anger when he receives a less welcome treatment. At the exaltation of the Messiah, Satan could not bear through pride that sight and thought himself impaired. Satan's sense of injured merit is reported in his first speech in hell. Ahab's story, caused by Moby-Dick biting off his leg, follows the same psychological pattern of being spiritually and physically impaired. We have a culture that allows us to be more and more obsessed and gives us more and more permission to focus on smaller and smaller things that don't really matter. All of us are pursuing white whales and are pursuing our own things that have bitten off our legs, either psychologically or spiritually stunting us, seeking to gain back what was once lost in a vainglorious attempt to repair that which we know is damaged. But obsession can kill, and leaders have to watch out for that especially. Be careful what whales you chase and why. And well, that's it for me. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show, that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show, as it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.